Trust us, the experts say. We're your one source of truth, they add. But what happens when they get it wrong? Unnecessary lockdowns is what? They were and remain unnecessary. But if you dare to challenge the orthodoxy of the government, you're held down as a denier. Well, the experts got it wrong, but as usual, it's the general public who suffer. We should always challenge the experts, and especially the politicians. Being a sheep just gets you led to the slaughter. A little bit like the lowest paid, who are constantly promised by Labour that if they're returned to government, then this time they'll share in the rewards. It matters not a bit that they've been promised this by Labour election after election with no actual delivery. It doesn't help that the media are as dumb as a bag of hammers and take the promises from politicians as gospel. But as more and more people discover the truth, the faster the anger is building. Will there be enough angry people before the election to change the government? Time will tell. I'm Cam Slater, and this is Insight Politics. Labour is promising a pay rise to those government cleaners, caterers and security guards on minimum wage if they're re-elected. Labour's policy would see core public sector agencies required to pay contractors a living wage before extending the rule to the wider state service, including district health boards, as the COVID recovery allows. And there is the weasel excuse, as the COVID recovery allows. But you have to wonder just what these workers think about this rather hollow promise. Labour have been in power for 3 years. They've had ample opportunity to pay these workers more before now. So why haven't they? In 2011, the then leader of the party, Phil Goff, was calling for increases in cleaners' pay. He said at the time, "We know that many New Zealand families are struggling to make ends meet. They're hurting and have been ignored by National, which borrowed billions of dollars to give tax cuts mostly to the top earners. That's not fair. Labour will not forget those Kiwis who need our help in the tough economic times." Except it would seem Labour did indeed forget those workers when they came to power 3 long years ago. And in 2017, Parliament's cleaners called for the introduction of the living wage. In December 2017, there was a living wage event held at Parliament after the election of the Labour-led government. So what happened? Well, it looks like nothing much at all, and now the weasels in Labour have the temerity to promise to do something next time, as the COVID recovery allows. But hang on a minute, didn't Labour already agree to this in 2017, that they would pay them the living wage by 2020? Why, yes they did, and it seems that this is yet another thing that Labour has failed to deliver on. Another failed delivery, another broken promise. And yet again, they've promised to do something and never have. When Labour says let's keep moving, perhaps they mean moving the goalposts. If I told you that the lockdowns were all based on a mistake, would you be angry? Well, Malcolm Kendrick, a doctor and author who works as a GP in the National Health Service in England, says the pandemic response of lockdowns is a terrible mistake. His blog is full of useful information, and his book, Doctoring Data, How to Sort Out Medical Advice from Medical Nonsense, is also available. He says in an article published at rt.com that a simple but fatal math mistake by US COVID-19 experts caused the world to panic and order lockdowns. He explains, "When you strip everything else out, the reason for lockdown comes from a single figure, 1%. This was the prediction that COVID, if left unchecked, would kill around 1% of us. You may not think that percentage is enormous, but 1% of the population of the world is 70 million people, and that's a lot. It would mean 3.2 million American dead and 670,000 Britons. But where did this 1% figure come from? You may find this hard to believe, but this figure emerged by mistake. A pretty major thing to make a mistake about, but that's what happened. One type of fatality rate was substituted for another. The wrong rate was then used to predict the likely death rate, and no one picked up the error. How can this be? We trusted these experts and they made a simple math error that has wrecked economies around the world. In order to understand what happened, you have to understand the difference between two medical terms that sound the same but are completely different. First, there's a thing called the infection fatality rate, IFR. This is the total number of people who are infected by a disease and the number of them who will die. This figure includes people who have no symptoms at all or only very mild symptoms, those who stayed at home, coughed a bit and felt a bit shit. And then there's the case fatality rate, the CFR. This is the number of people suffering serious symptoms who are probably ill enough to be in hospital. Clearly, people who are seriously ill, the cases, are going to have a higher mortality rate than those who are infected, many of whom don't have symptoms. Put simply, all cases are infections, but not all infections are cases. And this is where it gets interesting. The CFR will always be far higher than the IFR. With the flu, the CFR is around 10 times as high as the IFR. The Chinese plague seems to have a similar proportion, i.e., a bad flu but no worse. Except if you confuse those two numbers. You would either wildly overestimate or wildly underestimate the impact of the Chinese plague if you confuse the two figures, but that is what happened. On February 28, 2020, an editorial was released by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the editorial stated, "The overall clinical consequences of COVID-19 may ultimately be more akin to those of a severe seasonal influenza." They also added that the flu had a CFR of approximately 0.1%. One person in 1,000 who gets it badly dies. Except it isn't. They meant to say the IFR, the infection fatality rate for influenza, was 0.1%, not the case fatality rate. The mistake was compounded, though. A few days later, on March the 11th, the same experts testified to the US Congress, stating that COVID's case fatality rate was likely to be about 1%, so one person dying from 100 who fell seriously ill, which as time has passed has proved to be pretty accurate. At that meeting, they compared the likely impact of COVID to flu, but they used the wrong CFR for influenza, the one stated in the previous New England Medical Journal editorial, 0.1% or 1 in 1,000, the one that was 10 times too low. In other words, they declared the Chinese plague as being 10 times worse than the flu. If the flu killed 50, COVID was going to kill 500. If the flu killed 1 million, COVID was going to get 10 million. Little wonder Congress, and then the world, panicked, because they were told COVID was going to be 10 times worse than influenza. They were envisaging 70 million deaths around the world. I don't expect you or I to get this sort of thing right, but I bloody well expect the experts to do so. They didn't. They got their IFR and CFR mixed up and multiplied the likely impact of COVID by a factor of 10. Think about that the next time you hear a pronouncement from Labour-associated and so-called experts like Susie Wiles or Sean Hendy. Now think about the entirely unnecessary lockdowns we've all suffered. Are you starting to get angry? Because I am. To recap, on February the 28th, it was estimated that COVID was going to have about the same impact as a bad flu season. 11 days later, the same group of experts predicted the mortality rate was going to be 10 times as high. And this is where the mad modelers come in. Like the Chicken Little from Imperial College, Neil Ferguson, a man who has missed every single prediction he has ever made. Yet here he was again making a new model for the Chinese plague, a model that everyone in the world copied, including Sean Hendy and his like-minded pals at Otago University. On March 16, the mad modelers at Imperial College used an estimated IFR of 0.9% to predict that without lockdown, COVID would kill around 500,000 in the UK. Is this prediction anywhere close? Well, so far, the UK has had around 41,600 COVID deaths, significantly less than 0.1%, but not that far off. And this is how the predicted 80,000 deaths in New Zealand came from. The same number Jacinda Ardern, who is now running an election campaign on her response to the plague, used to lock us all down. And remember too that the lockdown initially for 9 days was illegal. All based on ridiculous models based on the wrong IFR numbers. Mistake upon mistake upon mistake. And we're told we had lockdown. Without it, so many more would have died. Most people have not been infected, etc. But would they have? To answer this, we need to know the true IFR. Is it a 0.1% or 1%? If it is 1%, we have more than 79,880 deaths to go. If it is 0.1%, then this epidemic is over, a busted flush, done and dusted. What we really need to know is what the real IFR is. And the best place to find that is Iceland, who have tested more of their population than anywhere else. As of last week, Iceland's IFR stood at 0.16%. It can't go up from there. It can only fall. People can't start dying of a disease that they haven't got. And this means they'll probably end up with an IFR of about 0.1%, maybe less. In short, the 0.1% prophecy has proved to be pretty much bang on, not much worse than a bad flu, which means that we'd have had almost all the deaths we're ever going to get. Maybe we're a bit behind the rest of the world because of the severity of our lockdown, but the likely death rate from the Kung flu is likely to be similar to our year-on-year death rates from influenza. And this also means that lockdown achieved almost precisely nothing with regard to COVID. No deaths were prevented. Almost no one is dying of COVID anymore, and most of those who do were otherwise very ill in the first place. And that is certainly the case with all our plague deaths so far. But wait, there's more. Medical terminology has been mangled by politicians and media so badly that the statistics are so out of whack they are almost meaningless. We now call a positive test a COVID case. This is not medicine. A case is someone who has symptoms. A case is not someone carrying tiny amounts of virus up their nose. So however you test positive, you're a case. Never in history has medical terminology been so badly mangled. Never have statistics been so badly mangled. Lockdown happened because we were told that COVID would kill 1%. But the plague was never going to kill more than about 0.1%. Max. We locked down in fear. We crippled the economy and left millions in fear of their livelihoods. We've wiped out scores of companies and crushed entire industries. We stripped out the health system and left thousands in prolonged pain and suffering on ever-lengthening waiting lists. There have also been thousands of delayed cancer diagnoses, the effects of which are yet to be seen. Lockdown can be seen as a complete and utter disaster, and it was all based on an amateur mistake, a claim that COVID was going to kill 1%. That claim can now be seen to be utterly and completely wrong. Sweden, which did not lock down, has had a death rate of 0.0058%. It takes a very big person to admit they've made a horrible, terrible mistake, but a horrible, terrible mistake has been made. Let's end this ridiculous nonsense now and vow never to let such monumental stupidity happen ever again. That's why we need a Royal Commission of Inquiry into all this, and then we shall see just how badly we were let down by the scientists, medical professionals, and most importantly by the politicians that are now campaigning on how well they did during the crisis. If you're not angry yet, you may still have noticed that anger is building. Sure, you still can't say out loud what you think of the Prime Minister for fear of triggering her army of COVID Karens who defend her every misinformed and mangled utterance, but the anger is building. A case in point is the number of people attending weekly protests organised by Billy TK and Jamie Lee Ross. 3 weeks ago they held their first rally. 100 people attended. 2 weeks ago they held another rally. 500 people attended. And this past week they attracted 2,500 people. Still small numbers. The important thing to note is that the numbers are increasing. And this is bad news for Jacinda Ardern. It shows that people are fed up. People who protest are like the rabbits you see in a paddock. Whatever you can see, there are 10 times that number underground. And that, my friends, is a sizable chunk of the voting public. The quiet people who say nothing but walk into a polling booth and vote to change the government. And as the harsh economic reality of the folly of lockdowns bites them, more and more people are going to realise that they're the ones having to make the sacrifices, while the politicians and civil servants making all the decisions that have cost voters their jobs and businesses are sitting pretty on full pay. The civil servants haven't suffered any of the pain, and they're still being paid whether they're at home or at work. And that's why I'm increasingly of the opinion that we need a civil servant tax for all civil servants, the only exception being frontline workers. Anyone employed by the state, arms of the state, and councils are included. Teachers, university staff, state sector employees, all of them except frontline staff like nurses, doctors, emergency services, police, etc. Say at a rate of 10% CST on all civil servant salary over 70,000. It seems fair to share the pain of the lockdowns. The secondary benefit is it should stop them all calling for lockdowns. When the universities get their funding slashed and all these academics are out on their asses, we'll see if they think lockdowns were a good idea. The pain of the decisions of Jacinda Ardern and her COVID cabinet are not being shared equally. The civil servants are the new rich. Time to sock them where it hurts. If you aren't angry by now, then you should be. We've been misled by the very people who now accuse anyone of presenting alternatives to their shonky view of being conspiracy theorists or deniers. Mistakes have been made, but it seems no one is going to own up to them. The politicians have painted themselves into a corner, which is why you're seeing a doubling down on the lockdown strategy. It's all they've got, plus masks. And on masks, are you sick and tired of the chicken littles out there asking you why you aren't wearing a mask? I am. I always retort that if we didn't have to wear masks in level 4, why do we have to wear them now? If the Prime Minister and Ashley Bloomfield told us in March that masks were useless, why are they telling us now to wear them? Medical science hasn't changed, so what has? Is it because they were simply rationing masks in March when they knew they didn't have enough? Or is it just conditioning us to obey our political lords and masters? I suspect it is the latter. When your strategy is lockdowns plus masks, and the facts coming out show that was a flawed strategy, then your only real option is to double down. An honest politician would admit they got it wrong, but the Prime Minister can't do that. She's got an election to fight based entirely on her performance battling the virus. She said that COVID shouldn't be politicised, Yet her first election advert does precisely that. As economic reality hits home, people are starting to wonder why it was their job or business that has had to be sacrificed, while those on fat state-funded salaries keep demanding lockdowns. The pain of the economic disaster isn't being felt equally. We now have a protected class of worker who hasn't suffered at all. They are the ones in state-funded jobs. The rest of us have to suffer. The politicians likewise are cosseted from the effects of their decisions. Where we are heading, though, is a kind of Marie Antoinette let them eat cake scenario. The elites in government and state-funded jobs are telling the peasants that they must endure lockdowns, the destruction of their jobs and businesses, and that it is the best thing for us. Well, if history serves us correctly, then we should be seeing some of those government elites lose their political heads when the peasants start revolting. The pressure is building. Will it come in time for the election? I'm Cam Slater, and this was Insight Politics.